Mrs. Fish, and welcome to Mrs. Fish's School. I have my master's in cultural linguistics and I've been teaching English language learners for over 10 years. And today we're going to dive into the topic of newcomers. Who are they and how do you support them in your classroom? All right, let's dive in. Okay, so the first thing you're going to do if you have a newcomer in your classroom is you are going to find out that student's background. All right, but before we dive into that, let's talk about some data. So 1 out of 10 public school students are English language learners. There's a lot of students. And out of that bundle of English language learning students, you're going to get newcomers. And if you haven't had a newcomer yet, I promise you probably will. A newcomer is any student that is new to speaking English. That means they have like zero proficiency to very minimal in the English language. These students can be from another country, or they can be from your community. 85% of English language learning students are from and born in our communities in the United States. And this is just meaning before their experience of coming to your public school, they have had no or limited English exposure. So they are going to need a lot of language acquisition in order to be successful in your classroom. So that's a little background about who English language learners are. Now, what do you need to know? So you need to know that student's background first. You need to know that student's name. Names hold power. What is that student's name coming into your classroom? Make sure you're saying their name correctly. The second is you need to find out what language does that student speak. What is their first home language? Do they speak multiple languages at home? That way you can best support them with their language acquisition if you know what language is their first language. All right, your next thing, 3, is you need to find out what their parents speak at home. Can their parents read or write in English, or do they also speak the same first language as the child in your classroom? And do they need things translated or interpreted? Now remember, underneath the federal law of Equal Opportunities Act, you must communicate to families in the language they understand. If you do not, you are breaking a federal law. So making sure you get all of that information translated so they can understand and participate in their child's education. After that, you want to find out your students' academic background. So do they have learning gaps? Have they been in the public school system since kindergarten? Did they move here from another country, another state? You want to try to find as much as you can about what their academic background is so that you can best support them in your classroom. And then paired with the academic background, you want to know if they can read and write in their first language. If they can, that's going to exponentially help their language acquisition depending on their age. So like a kindergartner might not, and that is okay because that's usually the time most students go to school anyways. But if a 5th grader or an 8th grader is able to read and write in their home language, that's awesome. You're going to be able to find them books in their first language or have them write in their first language and help them translate it. That'll help their language acquisition. Now, if you have a 9th grader that doesn't know how to read or write in their home language, that's going to be exponentially more challenging with their language acquisition because you're going to have to teach them how to read and write going back to the basics of letter sounds. It's just going to be harder to connect one to the other. So knowing their academic background, what if there's any learning gaps, and if they're able to read and write is super helpful for you driving your instruction, as well as finding out who is in their family household. So who do they live at home? Do they live with aunts and uncles currently? Do they have brothers and sisters? Do they come over, or maybe they live alone? Maybe they maybe they moved to this country all by themselves, or they live with grandparents, or they have a mom and dad, or just one mom, or their parents are divorced. Just knowing their family background, if you can find out that information, will really help you in supporting them in your classroom. So find out their background. All right, so now that you know your student's background, you need to then help and support the family. So what does that mean? That means all information to that family needs to be translated or interpreted in that family's home language if they do not understand English. And that is everyone's job. That is the district job, the admin's job, the teacher's job, the English language learning teacher's job, everyone's job in order to communicate to that family in a language they understand so they can support their kids. Why is this super important? The parents need to know, what days they need to send their kids to school, how to get them on the bus, what are parent-teacher conferences. They want to know what they're doing with their grades, if there are field trips, what that student is learning, anything that's coming up, literally anything. They should have equitable information about that student's education as any other parent in your school. So supporting the family will then inevitably support this child in your classroom, being the most successful they can be academically. Right, next, I bet you've been dying to know, how do I help them in my classroom? Okay, this is a doozy, and I doubt I'm even gonna touch on everything that you could do to support an English language learner. Please remember, this is very individualized to that student and their language acquisition needs. It depends on the grade level they're in, how much academic knowledge they have in their first language, and maybe what language they speak, maybe their background, if they have trauma in the past versus not having trauma in the past, will really add to that student's experience in your classroom academically and behaviorally. What could you do though to help them? Well, first, I would very much encourage you to create a welcoming classroom with your whole class. So making sure that your entire class is welcoming that student and making them feel comfortable. You can, if they do read their home language, labeling objects and ask things in the room like table, mesa, door, water, all of that, so that they're starting to have that language acquisition for their 1 to 2 and they're not totally lost in the room. Being consistent with structures. So explicitly teaching your routines and structures in your classroom and being consistent with those structures will help that student immensely feel safe and start to learn your routines and language acquisitions. Adding to that, teach your nuanced routines. Do not assume that an English language learner is gonna know how to go to the bathroom or how to ask to get their water bottle or know how to line up for recess or know how to get their lunch card. All of these things must be explicitly taught to these kids, because depending on what academic experience they've had in the past, or if they're coming from another country, there might be a lot of cultural norms that are extremely new to this child. And so don't be quick to reprimand a student for just getting up and leaving the bathroom when maybe they don't know your routines and structures and social norms in order to do step A to step B. So explicitly teaching the small pieces will make them feel really safe. So that will help you in your classroom. If that student has academic background in their home language, an amazing resource is getting them things in that language. I had a newcomer in my 5th grade class. He had been in school in El Salvador since kindergarten. He could read and write in Spanish beautifully. They were reading Hatchet in their class. I got Hatchet in Spanish. That way, what is their end goal? In that moment, I wasn't focusing so much on working on his language acquisition, but thinking about how are you accessing the content that's being taught in the classroom, so you can then combine your language acquisition of having discussions about the book. So breaking down those language barriers so they can access the content the best they can. I also like to have my newcomers, if they can read and write in English fluently, write maybe their papers in their language that they speak and then having that translated. If you're having them have directions, if you can translate those directions for them, and just breaking down any language barriers so they can start accessing the content. That is our biggest goal. All teachers are language teachers. We learn through and with language. And if you can break down those language barriers so they can access language, that is the biggest tip. Explicitly teaching vocabulary to English language learners is super important. Having visuals, contents, word banks, all of it. So there's a lot of resources you could do. I know I'm missing so many of how you can help a newcomer in your classroom. I would say use Google Translate when possible. It's not always super accurate, so just bear in mind that with all languages. My biggest thing is just do not just give them everything in English. Just because they have, the same teacher, the same textbook in English, the same resources in English, does not mean they're getting the same education as every student in the classroom, because language is a barrier and they're not accessing the content. So I need you to really work with your English language teacher to help that individual student break down language barriers so they can learn the content in your room. That is the biggest advice I have to you of helping your English language learner in your classroom. Okay, so that was how you help them in your classroom. Sorry that was so long. The next one is silent period. It's very typical for a newcomer to come into your classroom and have a period of silence. This means that they are going to be nonverbal because they're just listening and taking in the language. Imagine if you were just thrown into a school in Portugal and everyone around you was speaking Portuguese. You would probably be silent as well, because if you can't read, write, or listen or speak in that language, you're gonna feel a little bit overwhelmed. It's gonna be a cognitive overload of just hearing everyone talk around you and saying things that you don't understand. So they're gonna really be observing and listening and silent. If you ask them questions, even what is their name, they might not respond, and that's okay. Keep asking them, keep trying with that student to make them feel comfortable in order to be involved, speak in the classroom, do peer work in a safe and comforting way. And eventually, I promise you, they will start to speak. Make sure you're creating a safe and welcoming classroom, and be mindful of any social emotional support that a newcomer might need. So how are you educating the rest of your class about this student in your classroom in order for you to have a welcoming and safe environment for all students to be learning, and being culturally responsive to the kids and the needs of the students in your classroom? As well as, how can you help them social emotionally with being in your classroom? So if a student, they're gonna have much different needs if a child has been in the public school system since kindergarten, or if they have just moved to your school from another country. It might be a really big, culture shock. They might have maybe gone through some traumatic experiences, or they love to share their experiences from their other culture with your class in order to make connections. So just really thinking about who that child is and getting the resources they need if they need them, and accepting and welcoming that child's culture into your classroom to make a more diverse, beautiful, safe, and learning environment. Remember, learning a new language is exponentially challenging. So your goal is to help break down those language barriers to help that child learn. Every teacher is a language teacher. We learn through and with language. And so supporting that child the best you can in your classroom and making them feel safe, loved, seen, and breaking down language barriers is the best thing you could do for them. And please give them patience and grace when learning English, because learning a second language is very hard. Again, just imagine if you were moving to another country and thrown into a class where everyone is speaking a different language around you, and they're teaching different languages around you, and they're handing you tests in words that you cannot read yet. So I know it can be stressful having to support English language learners, but take a breath, reach out to resources, reach out to ESOL teachers. I'm happy to help with any individualized situations you might have and questions in order to make that student's academic career as successful as possible. Again, I am Mrs. Fish. This is Mrs. Fish's school. Please check out my other pages for more English language learning ways to support your kiddos. And I hope your day is going swimmingly well. I'm happy for you and your newcomers. See you later.